That Triathlon Show, episode 47. Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and if I sound a bit hurried today, it is because I am. It's 5 to 10 here in the evening, and I'm about to go on a big bike ride or brick workout tomorrow morning. And today is a Thursday, so it's work day tomorrow, and I need to get a 3-hour, 30-minute workout in before work, so that's not something that I usually do, which is why I'll record this intro and the outro really quickly, and also the editing will be really quick. There might be some sort of audio issues due to this. I don't have too much time, unfortunately, this time to proof edit everything down to the nth degree, but I hope that it will be good, and the actual episode itself is well worth listening to. The content is excellent. We have with us Andrew Buckrell from Stack Performance and Michael Liberzon from X3 Training, talking about the virtual wind tunnel, which is something that essentially allows you to get an aerodynamic analysis on your bike position done on cheap, conveniently, in any place where people can buy an iPad and a depth analyzer to get to attach to that iPad. But as I said, I'm trying to get to bed very soon to hopefully get my 7 hours of sleep. That should be 8, and that will be 6:30 by the time I finish editing this episode. But anyways, apologies in advance if there are some issues with the audio. I hope it will be good, and I definitely think that the information will be useful. So enjoy this interview. All right, I have two guests for today's episode of That Triathlon Show. I have with me Andrew Buckrell, who is the CEO and co-founder of Stack Performance, and Michael Liberzon, who is a coach and also bike fitter at X3 Training. And hey guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us, Michael.
So that was Andrew first and then Michael, just so the listeners can keep track of who's talking. And why don't we take just a brief moment so that you guys can give a brief introduction of your background and why you are here.
Sure.
Andrew, let's start with you.
Okay. So about myself, I am currently still a PhD student, but my interest in aerodynamics and bikes and training has really gotten me to where I am right now. So just through experimentation, working with a business partner, we got this idea about measuring aerodynamics for cyclists because wind tunnels are often inaccessible, and it's difficult for a lot of people to be able to afford them. So we thought, is there a way we can actually make this something that normal people can use? And you don't have to be a super high-end athlete with expensive sponsorship dollars pushing you forward. So we worked on this for a couple of years, developing aerodynamics, but getting to the point where we are now, having this experience and all these connections within the triathlon community, it's been fantastic, and it's something I love doing. I love working on. So it's really a dream come true for me, being able to work with high level athletes and being able to do something I love so much. So I guess that is the reason that I'm here right now.
Yeah, perfect. And Michael, what about you?
My triathlon career sort of started in around 2013 as an athlete, and my background is also in engineering. I'm a mechanical engineer, so fluid dynamics and aerodynamics are things that are not entirely foreign to me. And when I started coaching in around 2014, I always did take a more scientific approach to the sport. That's one of the aspects of it actually that really attracted me to it. And I'm always on the lookout for interesting and novel and useful, really, technologies and ideas to make my athletes perform better. And aerodynamics is definitely one of those things that is so very, very important to us on the bike, that if you can, if you can improve performance without getting any fitter, and for a lot of us that have been in the sport for a few years, getting those fitness gains is hard. So getting that bit of free speed is always a win. So I was turned on to the virtual wind tunnel and stack by I think our mutual acquaintance Cody Beals when he gave a talk at our studio, and got in touch with these guys, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and I think we just lost 80% of our listeners because they know that I'm an engineer as well, and they probably fear that this will be the driest conversation ever. But I think that the 20% that are still left will love this, because it might be some nerd talk, but we'll try to make it simple, folks. Just kidding. So the virtual wind tunnel, yes, that is the reason why we're here. And actually, Andrew, we have corresponded briefly in the past about it, because I included it in a blog post that I wrote about exciting new technologies that are coming out. And Michael, not knowing that, actually contacted me after finding that triathlon show and said that, hey, this would be a great topic for the show. And here we are. So Andrew, why don't you take this next question and give an overview from a simple perspective so that anybody can understand what the wind tunnel does more specifically, and how does it work?
Absolutely. So, like you said, I'll try to keep it away from the engineering talk. So, if I do get too technical, just let me know, and I can try to explain it a little bit better. But the whole process, like the name suggests, virtual, it's completely digital models that we deal with. So we use a process called computational fluid dynamics, which is often contracted to CFD. So you'll see this mentioned when companies are talking about aircraft development or race cars or things like that. So CFD is often used to numerically design something and test the fluid flow with it. So with CFD, it gives you the advantage of being able to look specifically at the fluid flow in any place. And you can take measurements, you can take comparisons, and be able to manipulate models and work completely within the digital world. So it's completely a question of how much computer power you have. So the process in general, breaking it down for an athlete who is interested in it. So we start off with scanning, and the scanning is really the critical part of it. So we want to capture a good physical model of someone. So we have a scanner that's it's actually iPad based, so it's very easy to use. It only takes about 2 or 3 minutes per scan. So during this process, the athlete themselves will be on their bike in their race position, holding a static position. And the person doing the scanning will walk around and try to capture all the different sight lines and angles so that we can reconstruct this model in 3 dimensions. And having the scanner itself as part of a portable platform, it makes it really easy to get all the angles we need and be able to just work with the athlete in any space at any location that they need. So it's much more convenient than going to a wind tunnel. Once we have the digital model, we take a computer software program that we've developed, and we reconstruct it. So the raw data from the scanner is just depth. So at any given point, if you imagine looking through the scanner, you can see basically an image of what you're looking at, except it's colored by depth instead of by actual physical color. And when you move that around, you get this point cloud. So this group of points that you're trying to match up and stitch together. So it's a big combination of all these different frames, and it's just a very difficult a process to reconstruct. It's very time consuming anyway. And and that's really the hardest part from our end. The CFD is fairly simple once you get a good model together. And then the next step, moving to the CFD, once we have the digital model, it's just a question of putting it through the software. We've worked a lot on the boundary conditions we use and the model setup. So that's streamlined, that's been tested a lot. And it just essentially goes through. You throw a lot of computer power at it, and then we get some output that represents what the fluid flow will look like. So we're able to simulate over basically an unsteady flow, so over a reasonable time period to see how the flow changes, how you would expect things to move around, and it gives us a really, really good idea of where drag may be coming from. And it allows you to do a lot of optimization for the cyclist.
So the output there is the drag, or the coefficient of drag, and where it is coming from.
Yeah. So we can see the actual numbers for drag, but on top of that, we can start digging into the model and look at specific areas. So maybe your helmet area is generating a lot of drag. Maybe there's a flow separation caused because your helmet isn't placed in the right location. And this flow separation propagates down your back and creates a lot of excess drag just because it's essentially disturbing the airflow. So with a wind tunnel, you get the numbers, but you wouldn't have necessarily a good indication of where that might be coming from. But with the CFD, because we can see how the fluid's moving at any point, we can go back and say maybe the cause of all this drag is just your helmet's in the wrong position. And small tweaks can now make a big difference in terms of performance.
Right, that is interesting. I hadn't thought about that you actually get some outputs that you don't even get in a wind tunnel. And we'll get back to that comparison with actual wind tunnels a bit later. But Michael, now I wanted to ask you, as somebody who is using this virtual wind tunnel and seeing clients and taking them through this process, when a client comes or triathlete comes to you to go through this process, what is it actually that you do? How long does it take, and what do the client get?
Well, there are two broad cases that I would split clients into. One type just wants a number, and we can talk about why they want a number. Typically, it's for modeling a race using software like Best Bike Split. So you need your coefficient of drag times area, your CDA. So that is something that a client may want for the position that they are already quite comfortable with. So that would be case number one, and that's a simple case, and that's just a matter of doing a single scan and having Andrew and the guys run their analysis on it. Most folks they are looking for a fit and some optimization, and then that of course depends on what we do there depends on how good their current fit is. So if it's somebody who's looking for a bit of optimization, what we would do is we would look at their current fit and see where there are opportunities to potentially make it better, make it more aerodynamic. The typical maxims are if you can lower the front end or make the front end narrower, that is typically faster. So that is something that we can test and see if that is in fact the case. Or we can test, of course, solutions like hydration, and the one that Andrew touched on, which is really, really important, is Aero Helmets, because they all, depending on the posture of the rider, different helmets will test very differently. So a helmet that may be super fast on one individual is going to be terrible on another, just because of the way their head is positioned. So we can do a little bit of optimization. So that would typically take 2 to 4 scans, depending on how many positions we wanted to test. And as Andrew said, the scanning process is pretty straightforward and pretty quick. It only takes about 3 or 4 minutes per scan. And then typically, of course, it depends on the bike and how easy it is to adjust. The modification of the position, as long as we're not making major changes, won't take very much time, between 10 and 15 minutes. So the whole process might take an hour. And then, of course, the full service, including a full fit, that would take anywhere from 90 minutes to 2.5 hours. Because before we even get into the VWT scanning, we would have to get the athlete into a position that is sustainable, where ergonomics are key. Ergonomics and power generation are key. So we get somebody to a position that is comfortable, and of course that all comes down to experience in fitness and mobility, especially in the hips, as well as the race duration. So somebody racing sprints, draft illegal sprints, might be far more willing to put up with an aggressive position where they can still generate power, whereas somebody who's doing an Ironman may want a little bit more of a relaxed position at the cost of aerodynamics. And then at the end of the process, at the end of the fit process, we would go through the 2 to 4 scans to really fine tune the fit. So really pick the best position out of maybe 2 or 3 positions that are already quite close.
And what happens next? Then you run the numbers, and when do the results come in?
So one of the...
go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say one of the challenges is just the turnaround time. Computational work in general tends to take a long time, and it's something that we're working on increasing the increasing the throughput of the simulations. But it's never going to be instant, at least not within the next 10 to 15 years. And that is the advantage of a wind tunnel, is you can change something on the fly and see exactly what the benefit is. But this, you have to use a little bit of intuition, a little bit of experience to really tweak it, but you also do have the benefit of seeing directly what happens in terms of the airflow. But sorry, I interrupted you, Michael.
No, not at all. So what we would do is, once we get to our 2 or 3 or 4 positions that we think may work, I would take detailed notes on whether it be stack and reach or just stem length, position of spacers, position pad width. That kind of information, and obviously the type of helmet model and the hydration options that we used in each of the scans. And then once we have the CDA numbers and potentially the report back from Stack, then the client would come back in for that final fit up. So we would say, case 2, let's say, was the fastest position, and case 2 had such and such a stem at such and such a height, and that's where we would go back to that position if that was not the last position that we tested.
Yeah, perfect. And one thing that I noticed just looking at your website was that you also have the option then, once the results come in, to look at a 3D viewer where you can compare yourself to different models, different riders that have actually gone through this process. So can you talk a bit about that, Andrew?
Yes, so this is something that's currently under development, but we're really excited about the possibilities with it. What we're trying to do is basically just every time we work with a professional who obviously doesn't mind having their model put up on the website, we're trying to collect those models and collect basically their position and how it changes and how certain people are fast. And that allows you to compare both yourself against a professional, but it also potentially allows other professionals to scope each other out and get an idea of what they might be doing that's different. And it is an interesting way to almost crowdsource information, crowdsource aerodynamic knowledge. But it is a very neat way to compare yourself. And even between myself and one of the Stat co-founders, Art, it's a very interesting comparison how we do aerodynamically. And Art he'll put out typically about 50 watts more than I will during a race, which is a substantial amount of power. And we're both the same height and around the same weight, but we end up at the same speed, which is really surprising. So when you see his scan, you can see there's major differences, and a lot of it comes down to physiology and flexibility, but it really is incredible how much of an impact aerodynamics has.
So that's interesting, but he has been going through this process and just found that he isn't able to, just for flexibility reasons and similar, to get to maybe as aggressive a position that would give him that aerodynamic benefit that would allow him to bring down the watts to go at the same speed. Is that the case?
Yeah, and it's it's partly comfort. I guess willingness to put yourself in a position that's maybe not as comfortable, but the flexibility is interesting too. Art's background is competitive swimming, so he's actually got quite a long torso, and I've got longer legs, so that naturally puts us in a slightly different position. So we've actually compared ourselves on each other's bikes, and I'm faster on both bikes, which is interesting. So it comes down to more than specifically the bike setup, but at this point, it probably would be worth getting Art in to see Michael about having a proper bike fit done, because that's not something he's done yet.
Yeah, and when you mentioned that you're excited about the 3D viewer, going back to that for a little bit, and having some pros allowing you to use their models, what does the future look like for that? Do you plan to make it a real source of big data that you can go to and really make it, try to optimize it and get as much out of it as possible? Or what's the future of it?
There's a couple different ways that we can look at this in the future. So one of them would be collecting, I guess, a public source of data. So just a general library that anyone could access. So if you want to look at, say, Cody Beals, for example, who's known to be very aerodynamic, versus someone like Lionel Sanders, who's not as aerodynamic but extremely powerful. you could see the differences just as an age group or athlete, or just anyone as part of the public. You could go in and look at the differences. So that's one aspect, just information and curiosity for most people. From a coach's standpoint, what we're able to do is put together essentially a private area where you can compare all of your athletes together, and you can compare different scans over time and have that repository of all that information, which would allow you to see, for example, one specific athlete. Maybe you have scans over a course of a year or two, or at different points in the season, or before and after an injury. So you would be able to see how that position has changed as a result of changes in flexibility or physiology. So it does offer a lot of tools for validation and comparison, not only from one athlete to themselves, but from different athletes to each other.
Yeah, I love that idea about having a repository for the coach as well. That's a great potential avenue for the 3D viewer. And going back just a little bit to Michael and the case where you have the athlete coming in and wanting both a fit and the aerodynamic assessment, just to make sure that listeners are aware of the variance. How much really can you do in terms of aerodynamics, and what is the variance that you see in how aggressive you can go with different athletes, really, in terms of their bike fit?
Are you asking the question, what's the difference between athlete A and athlete B?
Yeah, like kind of the compromise between aerodynamics and the fit that you need to make, and how it varies from athlete to athlete. If you can talk about that.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's incredibly different, and so Andrew had a great example of himself and Art. They have some morphological similarities and some differences, and there's the difference in their CDA is astronomical, to the extent that, with 50 watts more in the tank, Art is really going only about as fast as Andrew is. So that's a great case study right there. But even among my athletes, there are folks, and it's especially the ability to anteriorly rotate your pelvis is key. So that's to rotate it forward, which allows for a flatter and typically lower back. And that is something that even some very young and very fit athletes cannot do because of structural issues typically in their hips and pelvis. And so those athletes will tend to will never be able to achieve it as aerodynamic a position as others. It can definitely be optimized, but it may not be as fast as someone who is able to rotate their hips forward and really, kind of ride on the sits bones and on the nose of a saddle. So there is quite a bit of difference in terms of sheer numbers. We're trying to keep it from too nerdy, but if your listeners are familiar with good CDA values, you can get really low CDA values in the 0.22s for the really, really fast guys, the really aerodynamic guys, and someone who is maybe has some lower back issues or can't rotate their hips forward as much. Their CDA values, even on a TT bike, might be around 0.3. And in terms of speed differences, of course, it depends on how speedy and how powerful these athletes are. But the differences are dramatic. We're talking easily, 2 or 3 kilometers an hour for 200 watts or more.
Okay, so 0.22 to 0.3 is the range there, generally from very good to very bad. So what kind of benefits do you see when an athlete comes in and you do a scan or you test a few different positions? What have been some typical results that you've seen? How much have the CDA improved for some of your athletes, or if you have any sort of inkling about what the average would be?
Sure. We've ran about 6 of our guys right now, and the typical spread between, say, worst scan and best scan is about 0.02. So, from 2.5 to 2.7 is a common range. And that's not insignificant. I should have come prepared with some numbers, but over the course of an Ironman, that's definitely, or even a sprint, that's definitely a significant amount of time. Like enough, more time than, say, an expensive set of wheels might get you.
And Andrew, do you have some numbers for that off the top of your head?
I can pull up a spreadsheet here. So it wouldn't be just off the top of my head.
Okay.
The other interesting observation that Andrew first clued me on, and we've actually seen in testing, is with certain individuals, lower isn't better. So there comes a point with, especially with female riders, but even with some males, where a lower front end is actually slower than a higher front end. And Andrew can probably do a better job of explaining the reasons behind that. But that's an important observation for the simple reason that typically a higher front end tends to be a little bit more comfortable. So if we test those two positions and it turns out that the higher front end is a little bit faster than the lower and it's more comfortable, then there's really no reason to go lower.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Let's talk a bit about cost and availability. How much does it cost to get a scan with the virtual wind tunnel generally, and just as a comparison, what would go into an actual wind tunnel be?
So currently we're pricing them out at about $100 per scan. There are a couple of package options that Stack and I are working on, but the current cost per scan is $100. So what that gets you is some minor changes to the bike if that needs to happen. Obviously not a full fit. A scan, then the computational fluid dynamics work that the guys do, and a CDA number.
Is a scan in this case is that a few different positions that you?
Just one position. Just one position.
Just
so
one position, and yeah, okay. And yeah, okay, perfect. And what about availability? So you obviously do it, and you're located in Toronto, and we'll have all the links, of course, in on the show notes page. But it's X3 training. What about elsewhere in Canada and all around the world? Andrew,
Well,
can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, we've had a lot of people reach out to us. So we're in the early stages of negotiation with setting up remote scanning locations. So there's been a ton of interest. We're just getting off the ground. So there's, just off the top of my head, there's someone in Hong Kong, Switzerland, Sweden, Netherlands, so a lot in Europe, all over the world. But really, the amount of equipment and training needed is not that significant. Most people have an iPad. The scanner itself, which is an attachment to the iPad, that's about $350 US. So it's not a huge investment. So it's even something within the reach of, say, a triathlon club. And potentially what could happen is a club could purchase this, and then they could organize and train someone on the scanning. And then within the club, they could send back the different scans and work with us that way. So there's a lot of availability, and it's not something like going to a normal wind tunnel where you'd have to worry about the travel, unless you're lucky enough to live within a few kilometers of one of these wind tunnels. And there's really only a handful of them around the world that are equipped for testing cyclists. But the availability is one of the huge benefits of the 3D scanning. It can really be done from anywhere, and the amount of training is fairly minimal. So it's really accessible, and it's fairly scalable as well. And it allows us to make it so that typical age group athletes aren't afraid to ask about aerodynamics anymore, that it's something within their reach that they can benefit from. And going back to a bit earlier, so the number that Michael had mentioned, the 0.02 CDA change. So even something like that, which doesn't sound too significant, that can be almost 10 minutes on an Ironman split, depending on your power level. So there's significant gains to be had for relatively minor costs compared to some of the equipment that you can buy. So, and really most of the drag comes from the cyclist anyway. So this is the part we're trying to optimize.
Yeah, this is completely in line with some previous episodes we've had, for example, with the guys from Flow Cycling that talked all about these things, and they completely match up. What about the accuracy compared to wind tunnels? I know that you have numbers, and you are in the process of publishing a paper, aren't you?
Yep, that's right. So we've done a couple different studies. So as a general comparison, so working with Cody Beals, we were within 2 to 3% of his wind tunnel tests at the faster wind tunnel in Arizona. And I was recently invited down there by Ventum to basically work with their athletes during the wind tunnel session. So I don't have all the data yet, but I'm going to compare all of their wind tunnel results with as many athletes as I scanned. So I should have at least 8 or 9 data points, which would be a good comparison. On top of that, recently I worked with one of the slow twitch editors, and I was able to match up the predictions for the different helmets that he had wind tunnel results for. So I was very close on those as well. So we've seen fantastic correlation with wind tunnel data, and even with our own testing. So the paper you mentioned that we're working on, this was done with a scale model, and we were within 1% of the wind tunnel results for that model. Now, the model was created directly from a scan, so we've taken out the accuracy of the scan as part of the equation there. But the split of uncertainty, I guess, would go half between the numerical simulation and half between the scanning resolution. But we're within, I feel, the repeatability of most wind tunnels or other experimental methods. So it's not necessarily a replacement for any of those, but it's another tool in the toolbox that can help you make good decisions on equipment.
Yeah, and I don't think that we actually got a number yet about what would the cost be if you would want to go to the wind tunnel and have a test there. Do you have any idea?
It varies from wind tunnel to wind tunnel. In Ontario, I heard that there's one in Oshawa, so just east of Toronto, that's a climactic wind tunnel, and it's quite large, but they're setting it up for cycling now, and I think it's on the order of $800 to $1,000 Canadian an hour. The faster wind tunnel, from memory, it's around $450 to $550 US an hour. Plus, you have to factor in your travel time. So there are a couple that are nearby some people, but for the vast majority of people, you're going to have to pay for a flight and a hotel for a couple days and meals and all those other incidentals. So it ends up costing several $1,000s sometimes to get the wind tunnel results.
It does. What about limitations of the virtual wind tunnel? You touched upon a few of these already, but just to quickly sum them up here.
Yeah, so one of the biggest limitations that I think exists is just the turnaround time. And this is something that we're working on improving. So currently, it takes maybe 2 to 3 days to turn around the results, provided that we're not too busy. And that will be multiple scans and a full report returned to you. In the ideal scenario, we're hoping to get this down to 24 hours by taking advantage of cloud computing. But it doesn't have the instant feedback or near instant feedback that something like the wind tunnel has, or even the Alpha Mantis system. So that is a bit of a downside, but as I mentioned previously, the side benefit is you get a lot more detail about the flow. Another downside is that the results are only as accurate as the scanning process. And this is something that we're constantly working on improving. But there are certain features that won't get picked up by scanning. So, for example, spokes and cables, even using high-end commercial 3D scanners, which might cost $30,000 or $40,000, they often don't pick up these features as well. So it's just a question of how important are they in the overall solution. And they obviously do make a contribution, but the angle that we come from is that each scan is consistent. So it may miss those details, but it's not like another scan is incorporating them. So it's really, you're comparing the same limitations all the time. And you've got a good baseline, you've got a good comparison for each one of the scenarios.
Yeah, perfect. What about the future? I read somewhere, might have been that slow twitch article that you mentioned actually, about Cody Bills and how he's become involved just because he was so impressed with the innovative approach that you have to things and all those ideas being thrown around at the office. So what can you talk about as it pertains to the future of stack performance?
Well, we've got our fingers in a lot of different pies right now, I guess, if you want to use that analogy. But we're excited about a bunch of different things that we're working on. So there's a few aerodynamics devices that we're developing, and a lot of those have been with the help of Cody and his input, and actually using the virtual wind tunnel as a development platform and a testing platform to see how it would do. And on top of that, the other exciting thing right now that we're working on is a variable resistance version of our trainer, which is completely unrelated to the wind tunnel. But that is, as far as the future of Stack, that is the key there. So the trainers, that's kind of our bread and butter, but we also want to get into looking at how we can extract more performance from people, whether it's aerodynamics or other methods, just to help people perform at their best. And that's really what we're all about. We want to improve just every athlete out there.
Perfect. Let's roll into a few rapid fire questions, and I'll let both of you each answer these questions, but please be quick because we are running out of time a bit. So the first question is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to triathlon, starting with Michael?
I really like Fitzgerald's How Bad Do You Want It? Just because, psychology and training and racing is becoming such a big deal recently, whereas physiology was always king before. And he's got some really good and very readable, some really good examples and some really good solutions for it in a very readable kind of package.
Andrew?
I'm actually going in the other direction. So training and racing with a power meter is probably the turning point for my own personal training, where I really incorporated power-based training and learned how to improve my body so much more.
What's your favorite piece of gear or equipment, Michael? Excluding virtual wind tunnel.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. I'm a big fan of my power meter. It's a tool that on the bike, without which I feel kind of a little bit handicapped. It's such a beautiful, objective way of capturing effort that nothing really beats in any of the other sports.
And Andrew?
Slightly biased opinion here, but my Stack Zero trainer. So I do most of my training indoors just because it's so much more controlled and so much easier to get a good workout.
Yeah, I should have excluded that, but we'll put it as bike trainer. No, it's good. And finally, what are your personal habits that have contributed to your success, Michael?
I think certainly consistency is key with training and with anything else. It's and especially with my athletes, with both new athletes and veterans. The ones that train in the most consistent fashion are the ones that see the best results.
Andrew?
For me, I think it's the competitive spirit that really pushes me forward. So just being at a high level with whatever I do, that's one thing that I really encourage of other people. Not to the point that it's unhealthy, but just a healthy competitiveness, I think, is definitely a good way to get the most out of yourself.
Perfect. And finally, tell us where the listeners can find you on the internet or on social media. Let's start with Michael.
Yeah, we have a presence on Instagram, X3 Training, on Facebook, also X3 Training, and the website is, again, x3training.com. So that's x3training.com.
And Andrew?
So our main website is stackzero.com. That's STACZERO, and you can link to the virtual wind tunnel through there. And we've got our 3D viewer on that as well. So that's a good place to get started in learning about us. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram under Stack Performance.
Perfect. And everything will be linked up in the show notes. So thank you, Andrew and Michael. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having us.
All right, that has now taken me around about 9 minutes to edit up until this point, and the clock is now 5 minutes past 10 here. I'm trying to get this done in 10 more minutes or so, and I really, really hope that it will come out good, or good enough at least. So that will give me 6 hours 45 minutes to sleep, which is enough for a one-off. I'm a big proponent of sleep, but I will be just fine for tomorrow's workout. The show notes for today's episode will, as usual, be found on thattriathlonshow.com. Remember to subscribe to the podcast if you aren't already, so you automatically get the 2 new shows that I release every single week for your listening pleasure. And final words. Next episode will be all about how to run well off the bike. And that is something that has been a very much requested topic. So I put a lot of time in that. It's already essentially, it is recorded. I just need to do the editing. It's a solo episode, but I put a lot of time and effort into that episode. So I'm excited for it, and I think that you'll love it. Until then, keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.